Silence used to feel neutral. It wasn't something people noticed. It simply existed between moments. But at some point, silence started to feel heavy, uncomfortable, almost threatening. Not because it changed, but because something else did. And most people never noticed when that shift happened. Silence was never the problem. Silence was never the problem. For most of human history, silence existed without needing explanation, without demanding interpretation, without triggering any kind of internal reaction. It was not experienced as empty or threatening, but as something neutral, almost invisible, because it did not interrupt anything important. Silence simply existed between moments, between actions, between conversations, and because it asked nothing from the mind or the body, it rarely became noticeable. What matters here is that silence did not need to be managed. People did not think about it, optimize it, or escape from it. It did not represent lack, danger, or exposure. It was part of the natural rhythm of experience, and because it was predictable, it felt safe. That safety was never consciously taught, it was learned simply by repetition, by living in an environment where silence did not mean uncertainty. Silence used to be invisible. Silence used to be invisible because it carried no expectation. When nothing was happening, nothing was required internally. The mind did not rush forward to fill the gap, and the body did not remain alert, waiting for the next stimulus. Silence marked a transition, not a void. It allowed attention to rest without needing direction, without needing justification. Because silence had no function, it created no tension. It did not invite reflection, analysis, or self-monitoring. It simply allowed experience to reset before something new arrived. And because this rhythm repeated itself naturally, the nervous system learned that stillness was not a problem to solve, but a condition that required nothing at all. When silence stopped being empty. At some point, silence stopped being empty. Not in the external world, but internally. The moment sound faded, something else appeared to take its place. Thoughts began to surface faster. Attention turned inward more abruptly. Silence became a space where the mind started to populate what was once left untouched. This did not happen suddenly. There was no clear moment where silence changed its meaning. It happened gradually, as silence became less frequent and less familiar. And when silence appears less often, it stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like an unusual state, and unusual internal states are rarely comfortable, especially when the mind has lost the habit of remaining unoccupied. The first discomfort was subtle. It did not feel like fear or anxiety. It felt like restlessness, like something unfinished, like a low-level urge to move, check, or distract. Most people did not question it. They assumed it was boredom, impatience, or personality, without realizing that a deeper tolerance had quietly shifted. This discomfort did not announce itself loudly. It appeared in small moments, during pauses, during waiting, during quiet transitions. And because it was mild, it went unnoticed. But over time, that mild discomfort became consistent, teaching the system that silence was no longer a place of ease, but a space that required management. Noise as regulation. Slowly, noise began to serve a new function. Not pleasure. Not entertainment. Regulation. Sound, activity, and constant input started organizing internal states that silence no longer could. Noise provided structure, rhythm, and predictability in a way silence stopped offering. This does not mean people became addicted to noise. It means noise replaced a role silence once played. And when something becomes regulatory, its absence is felt immediately. Silence, once neutral, began to feel destabilizing, not because it was harmful, but because it no longer fulfilled the role the system had adapted to expect. The loss of internal anchors. What was quietly lost during this transition were internal anchors. Those subtle reference points that allowed a person to remain present without needing constant external input. Anchors are not thoughts or techniques. They are embodied sensations of orientation, continuity, and containment that make stillness feel structured rather than exposed. When these anchors disappear, silence stops feeling held. It becomes open space without boundaries. An unbounded internal space invites the mind to step in. Not because something is wrong, but because the system no longer trusts the environment to provide structure. The loss of anchors does not create noise immediately. It creates instability, and instability always seeks compensation. When the mind fills the gap, when silence appears and there is nothing anchoring attention, the mind fills the gap. It replays conversations, anticipates outcomes, evaluates past decisions, and scans for what might be missing. Silence becomes occupied, not by peace, but by unresolved material that was never meant to surface all at once. This is not a failure of the mind. It is a natural response to the absence of containment. When external structure disappears, internal activity increases to compensate. And over time, silence stops being associated with rest and starts being associated with mental effort. The body learns that quiet moments require work. Silence is exposure. As this pattern repeats, silence slowly begins to feel like exposure. A moment where there is nothing to buffer awareness, nothing to soften attention, nothing to redirect focus outward. Silence removes the layers that normally protect the mind from itself. This exposure is subtle. It does not feel dramatic. It feels uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain. A quiet vulnerability emerges, not because something dangerous is happening, but because the system is no longer supported by the rhythms it once relied on. Silence reveals what noise has been containing. Why distraction feels safer? Distraction feels safer because it provides immediate structure. It narrows attention, limits awareness, and gives the mind something predictable to hold on to. This is not about pleasure or entertainment. It is about regulation and containment. When distraction becomes the primary way of organizing internal states, silence feels unsafe by comparison. Not because silence harms, but because it removes the scaffolding the system has learned to depend on. Safety shifts from internal grounding to external input, and silence becomes associated with loss rather than relief. The body learns faster than the mind. The body adapts faster than conscious understanding. Long before the mind labels silence as uncomfortable, the body has already learned to associate it with uncertainty. Muscles hold slightly more tension. Breathing becomes less fluid. Attention stays alert. This alertness is not anxiety. It is readiness. A subtle preparedness that keeps the system from fully settling. And readiness, even when mild, is incompatible with deep rest. Over time, the body begins to anticipate silence as a state that requires vigilance rather than surrender. This was never about technology. This shift is often blamed on technology, but technology is not the cause. It is a carrier. The deeper change lies in the disappearance of rhythms that once created natural containment, clear transitions, predictable pauses, and moments where nothing was expected. Technology did not remove these elements on its own. It accelerated a system that no longer values closure or completion. And when closure disappears, silence no longer signals safety. It signals uncertainty, not because something bad is coming, but because nothing clearly ends. What was quietly removed? What was quietly removed was not silence itself, but the conditions that made silence feel safe. Predictability. natural endings, shared rhythms, the sense that effort was followed by release, and that release required no justification. Without these conditions, silence lost its function. It stopped being restorative and became ambiguous. And ambiguity is uncomfortable for systems that depend on structure to regulate themselves. Silence did not change. Silence did not change. The relationship to it did. And relationships do not shift all at once. They drift. They transform quietly, through repetition and adaptation. Discomfort appears not because something is broken, but because something familiar no longer fits the way it once did. Understanding this reframes the problem. Silence is not hostile. It is revealing the absence of what used to support it. A quiet open end. Perhaps silence feels uncomfortable today not because it is empty, but because it exposes what has been missing for a long time. Not stimulation, but grounding. Not noise, but containment. And perhaps the discomfort that arises in silence is not something to eliminate, but something to listen to. Not as a signal that something is wrong with you, but as a sign that the environment you adapted to no longer provides what the body needs to settle. Silence didn't become uncomfortable by accident. It became uncomfortable because the structures that once held it quietly disappeared. When nothing truly ends, when nothing truly settles, silence stops feeling like rest and starts feeling like exposure. Not because silence is dangerous, but because it reveals what has been missing for a long time. Maybe the discomfort you feel in silence isn't something to fix. Maybe it's information. A signal that something in the rhythm of life no longer supports stillness the way it once did. If this resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring what quietly changed the way we experience our own minds, consider subscribing.